Lurking in the dark. Have you ever felt that cold chill on the back of your neck when you're alone in the dark? That sensation that something is lurking just beyond your sight, waiting for the right moment to strike? Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story about something that lurks in the dark. Something that isn't just a figment of imagination. If you've ever experienced something creepy or had an unsettling encounter, comment below and share your thoughts or stories. Or maybe, tell me what you want to hear next. Now, let's get into the story. Jenny had always been drawn to the quiet, the peacefulness that came with being alone at night. There was something about the stillness of her apartment, the way the darkness wrapped around her like a protective blanket, that made her feel safe. But that feeling was slowly beginning to change. It started with small things, noises in the night, things out of place. She would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, unsure of what had disturbed her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the result of stress from work. But as the nights wore on, the feeling grew stronger. The feeling that something was watching her. One night, after returning home late from work, she noticed something strange. Her front door, which she always locked, was slightly ajar. She froze on the threshold, staring at it for a long moment. Had she forgotten to lock it? No, she was sure she had locked it. But there it was, just barely open, as though someone or something had been there. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for anything out of the ordinary. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the room. She shivered and quickly made her way to the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The kitchen seemed fine. Nothing was out of place. Yet, as she turned to leave, she noticed something else. The living room window was wide open. The night air was cool, and a faint breeze stirred the curtains. Jenny had definitely closed the window before she left for work. A knot twisted in her stomach. Her first instinct was to check the apartment again, to make sure nothing had been stolen or moved. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond the shadows. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe she had forgotten to close the window. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, as Jenny lay in bed, the sounds began again. At first, it was a faint creak, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway. She lay still, listening. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she strained to hear, but it stopped before she could make out anything. She told herself it was nothing. The house settling, maybe, or the wind rattling the windows. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and closed her eyes, trying to fall asleep. But then it came again. This time it was louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallway outside her bedroom. Jenny's eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. She held her breath, trying to remain as still as possible, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside her bedroom door. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. She dared not move, barely even breathed. The silence was suffocating, stretching on longer than it should have. Then, the door creaked open slowly, just a crack. Jenny's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't see anything, just the shadowed outline of the door in the darkness. But she felt it. The presence. It was there, just beyond the door. The faintest rustle, like something shifting in the shadows, was the only sound. Then the door creaked again, this time slowly closing, as though someone had been watching her, waiting for her to make a sound. Jenny lay frozen, her mind racing. Who was there? What was happening? Her mind screamed at her to get up, to check, to do anything, but she was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't even think. The night dragged on in agonizing silence. She never fell asleep again, and when morning came, the shadows still seemed to linger in the corners of her apartment, as though something had been there the entire time, just waiting for her to notice. The following night, the feeling intensified. The air in the apartment grew colder, and the darkness seemed deeper, thicker. Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Something was watching her from the dark corners of the room. That night, she decided to confront it. She waited, her eyes fixed on the hallway outside her bedroom, her hand gripping the edge of the bed, ready to leap up at any moment. As the clock ticked on, the silence seemed to stretch endlessly. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer. They were right outside her door, and Jenny could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping as if something was sucking the warmth from the room. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. Her voice was barely a whisper as she spoke into the phone, telling the operator that someone was in her apartment. But before she could say anything else, the footsteps stopped. The line went dead. Jenny's blood ran cold. The door to her bedroom creaked open slowly. This time, she was ready. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and stood, her legs shaking beneath her. She shouted, "Who's there?" The door swung open fully. There was nothing there. The room was empty as it had been before. But the shadows, they weren't. They were deeper now, darker, crawling along the walls like they were alive. And in the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest, she saw it. A figure, just barely visible, standing motionless. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her with dark, hollow eyes. Jenny screamed, but the figure didn't react. It just watched, waiting for something. Then the shadows seemed to rise up, stretching toward her, and the figure melted into the darkness, vanishing as though it had never been there. Jenny rushed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she turned to look back, the apartment was silent again. The shadows were gone. The footsteps had stopped. For the next few days, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though the presence in her apartment had never left. Every time she turned around, she felt it there, lurking in the corners, waiting. And then one night, the shadows returned. This time, they didn't just watch. They moved, slithering across the walls, curling toward her with a sense of urgency. Jenny tried to run, but the darkness seemed to follow her, swallowing her whole. She was never seen again. The apartment remained empty for weeks, until one day, a new tenant moved in. They were excited, eager to start fresh in a new home. But when they stepped inside, they felt it, like something was lurking in the dark, waiting. And in the far corner of the room, they saw a shadow move. What do you think? Do you have any creepy experiences of your own? Or maybe suggestions for another spooky story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them.